be here. Thank you. Though I think, don't people from Norfolk say Norfolk? Isn't that
I'm from New York. I'm just kind of here for the better air.
Okay, because I went to rabbinical school with someone from Norfolk, and I was told how to pronounce it. Thank you so much for the warm welcome introduction. It's quite an intimidating thing to follow Professor Daniel Matt. I caught the last bit of his session, and he has all these books behind him, many of which he wrote and he translated. And so it's great to be part of this discussion and part of the JCC. You only see my screen here, but if you knew what I knew in the back office, as it were, how the sausage, if I can say such a thing, on Shavuot is made, there are many, many professionals of the JCC. I've taught in the JCC Tikkun over many years, and they are just as busy tonight making this Torah possible in all of the rooms, and all the tech professionals and all of the many, many people learning right now, making this extraordinary evening possible. It's an honor to be a part of it. You know, earlier in the evening, I was part of another discussion, a very different setting, and I was asked the question point blank, what Shavuot is about. And this individual who was questioning me was saying, look, I don't really buy this dairy business. Not as many people show up to shul. There's no enemy on Shavuot as there might be on other holidays. You need a good enemy to create a good narrative. What exactly is this about? And then when I said Torah, they said, well, isn't that what Simchas Torah is about? Why do we need two holidays? Why do we need Shavuot? And why do we need Simchas Torah all at once? And I promise you, we're going to get to the topic of before Sinai and after Sinai. And I was running out of answers for this individual of what makes Shavuot so compelling, someone who is really on the periphery of Jewish life and living. And I explained, I just stopped. And I said, have you ever received a love letter? He took, you know, a pause, 2 beats. And I said, think about how you felt when you received that love letter. At that moment, how you read each and every word carefully, and you analyzed what was the intent behind the choice of that word and that comma and that paragraph break, and you took care of that letter. And if that person meant something to you, or if you felt that the sender of that letter meant something to you, you put that letter in a very safe place. And some of those love letters have legs to them, and some of those love letters don't. But even then, you might find yourself retrieving that letter and thinking about that moment you received that letter, reading it over nostalgically, or perhaps presently, asking how different you are now. And I painted the scene as I'm doing for you right now. And I said, for Jews, that's what Shavuot is. The love letter we received from God. Revelation, God is unknowable. The closest we have to accessing, experiencing the divine presence is the love letter of Torah sent to us, delivered to us, given to us at Mount Sinai. The narratives that bind us and shape us as a people. And it's not just a book of stories, it's also a book of legislation. Within the Torah itself, it commands us as to how to regulate our lives, create rhythms to our existence. That's what Shavuot means to us as a Jew, as a Jewish community. And so the power of Shavuot is the idea that the Kadosh Baruch Hu, that God gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai. What I want to explore with you this evening, in a roundabout way and by way of Midrashim before, and we'll get to one after Sinai, which is whether or not the rabbis ever entertained the possibility that maybe it ain't so. maybe the authority of the text was not contingent on the proposition of Shavuot, meaning philosopher William James once made this distinction between the root and the fruit of revelation. The root meaning its authority comes by way of the origin of that text. That's how scriptural authority is established. And the fruit is that its authority, its hold, its power over us is not so much about identifying the giver and the recipient, but it is about the fruit, the effect that the Torah has on our lives. And perhaps there are different modalities, different ways to think about authority of commandment and authority when it comes to the ties that bind us together as a Jewish people. I want to invite everyone, if you want to, I have the chat bar. We're going to go directly to the text right now. If there are questions that you have, I believe you can send them in to the chat bar. Every so often, best I can, I'll take a look, and I'll make sure that I leave time at the end. I have more text and we do have time to cover it, but I just wanted to sort of level set. And though the name is somewhat elusive, before and after Sinai, you'll quickly understand where I am and where I'm going. Or maybe not, but it'll be a fun hour that we will spend no matter what. The text that I was teaching in my Tuesday morning class this week was a text that created some stir in our community around the year 2014. A New York-based lawyer wrote an article in Commentary magazine on the idea of social orthodoxy. And Jay Lefkowitz, who had a visual for the first time this week, he joined our class, a heck of a nice guy, wrote the following. He wrote, as a matter of doctrine, the fundamental tenet of Orthodox Judaism is a belief that on Mount Sinai, I'm hoping everyone can see this text. It says it's screen sharing, so hopefully it works. God transmitted to Moses both the written law and the oral law. That's what the premise of this festival is about. That is why Orthodox Judaism is generally resistant to changing interpretations of the law, except where there's some precedent for it. To be sure, many modern Orthodox rabbis and some of their congregants are steadfast in their faith and look to halakha to guide all aspects of their lives, precisely because that is the revealed word of God. So far, so good. Everything is very straightforward. But if unwavering acceptance of the Torah as divine is a precondition for orthodoxy, then the term modern Orthodox may well be a misnomer. For many Jews who identify as modern Orthodox, they might more accurately be described as social Orthodox, with the emphasis on social. Social Orthodox Jews fully embrace Jewish culture and Jewish community, and they're committed to the survival of the Jewish people. Indeed, that is their raison d'etre. Furthermore, because religious practice is an essential component of Jewish continuity, social Orthodox Jews are observant, and not because they are trembling before God. The point, and I encourage everyone to read the article on your own if you haven't already, and it created quite a stir because whereas Reform Jews and conservative Jews and many Jews have long understood that the compelling reasons for Orthodox practice may have been, for observance may not be founded in the divine origin of the text. This was a fascinating article because it suggested that within Orthodoxy itself, maybe there are those who say it ain't so. Maybe there are those who ain't so, and that their reasons for observance are actually not about the authority of the text. So there are a million moments in history that I can show and demonstrate this challenge to traditional notions of the authority of the text. But this was, I felt, Lefkowitz's article as good a chance as any. So why is this class called Pre-Sinai and Post-Sinai? Someone just wrote, please repeat where to find the article. The answer was in Commentary Magazine in 2014. The author's name is Jay Lefkowitz. Jay Lefkowitz. And I'll write that at the end during the Q&A. So this is a moment, Exodus chapter 16, that the children of Israel, so this is why we're before Sinai. This is prior to the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Chapter 15 is the Song at the Sea, and significantly, we'll get to this momentarily, the issue of the manna coming from heaven. Here, excuse me, this is the manna coming from heaven. And here it says, setting up from Elim, the Israelite community came to the wilderness, which is between Elim and Sinai, which is where they're going to get to on the 15th day of the second month after their departure from the land of Egypt. And Jews being Jews, they grumbled. They grumbled against Moses and Aaron. They said, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord. And we know this story, or it's a great story if you don't know it, because the manna came down from heaven. It was the Instacart of the day. And they were given this manna. I will rain down for you from the sky, and the people shall go and gather that each day, that I may thus test them to see whether they will follow my instructions or not. But on the sixth day, so this miraculous flaky substance that came down from the heavens, that according to tradition tasted whatever it wanted to taste like. If you wanted it to taste like pizza, it tasted like pizza. If you wanted it to taste like, and there's actually a great reference, and the guy wrote my dissertation on, Rabbi Louis Jacobs, about were you allowed to imagine the manna to taste like treif? If I wanted to imagine it tasted like lobster bisque, could I think that? Okay, but on the sixth day, when they apportion what they've brought in, it's a double thing, a double portion. That's why we have 2 challahs on our Shabbos table, because we had a double portion. And sure enough, that's what happened. And let's get to the point of why I'm drawing your attention to this. Because even though they were given this commandment not to collect on the Sabbath, it says, sure enough, and Moses said to them, I'm now on verse 19, let no one leave any of it over until morning. But they paid no attention. Some of them left of it till morning, and it became infested, and Moses was angry, so they gathered it every morning, each as they did. And on the sixth day they gathered double the amount of food, 2 omers for each. And when all the chieftains of the community came and told Moses, he said to them, this is what the Lord meant. And I'm sorry, it's not lined up right. Vayomer Alehem, Hu asher diber Hashem, Shabbaton Shabbat Kodesh Ladonai. This is what God meant. Tomorrow is a day of rest, a holy Sabbath of the Lord. Bake what you would bake, and boil what you would boil, and all that is left put aside unto the morning. Ada boker kasher tziva Moshe, as God had commanded regarding the Sabbath law. And that is what happened. And despite the fact that they had been commanded this, many of them did not follow the commandment. Let's just do stop share. So here is my question for you. What's the problem with this text? What is a problem with God saying, or by way of Moses, right? This is what, let's see if people are paying attention on the Q&A and on the chat bar. What is the problem where it says, Kasher tziva, or Hu asher diber? This is what the Lord commanded, or as the Lord commanded, as the Lord spoke. What's the, as my father would say, what's the fly in the ointment here? What's the problem of the text? This is, I'll give you a hint. This is chapter, what do we say it is? Chapter 16. 6 participants raise their hand. How do I do that? Okay, so C Q&A for questions. I'm doing C Q&A for questions, but no one's answering my question. Is it because Emily Thompson says Nice,
I think
Emily.
we have to unmute. If you want to hear them, we have to actually unmute them, but I can try and do that. Or
No, it's okay. Emily's already got it.
Okay.
But Emily writes, is it because they are not in covenant together? You're absolutely right. Because if this is in chapter 16 of the book of Exodus, then the problem of it is that Mount Sinai has yet to happen. There is a commandment referenced about the Sabbath, about not to collect the manna on the Sabbath, and they're punished for the breach of that commandment. And the Sabbath has not actually been given because this is pre-Sinai. Sinai has yet to happen. Now, of course, we have creation, right? We know that in the Ten Commandments, in one version, it says that you should remember the Sabbath because you were once a slave, and the other, it's because it's a sign of creation. But it seems to be the case that there's a specific reference to a sense of being obligated to Shabbat, and that there had been sort of a pre-Sinaitic legislative moment about which we don't know anything about. Daba, so if someone says they raise their hand, I'm not quite sure what to do. But I do see a hand there.
Either. Let me.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to keep going, but I don't want you to think I'm being rude. So, but maybe at the end, or write your question in the chat bar. So what's this referring to? And this puzzled the rabbis, and there's a rich, rich literature. What, for reasons that will become apparent to you as we proceed, I believe to be some of the most intriguing primary texts on this question of Jewish identity formation, the authority of the text, the authority of the commandments prior to the moment of Sinai. And Rashi, the 11th century exegete, on that very verse, on chapter 15, verse 25. So this is actually prior to that moment, right? The manna story was chapter 16. Now we're moving back to Exodus 15. There's a very enigmatic scene which happens, and we usually just sort of gloss over this because we read in synagogue the Song at the Sea, and then we go directly into the manna story. But there is this passage in Exodus chapter 15 that after the Moses caused Israel to set out the Sea of Reeds, they travel into the wilderness of Shur. They traveled 3 days in the wilderness, and they found no water. All of this is prior to the manna story. They came to Mara, but they could not drink the water of Mara, v'lo yochlu lishtot mayim, because it was bitter, which is why, if those of you who know Hebrew, it was named Mara. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink? Ma nishteh?" And they cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. This is very strange stuff. The point I want you to focus on is what happens next, because it says, "Vayim teku hamayim," and the water was sweetened. Sham sam lo chok umishpat vesham nisahu. There he made for them, verse 25, a fixed rule, and he put them to the test. The Hebrew is chok umishpat. If you heed the Lord your God diligently, doing what is upright in his sight, giving ear to his commandments, and keeping laws, I'm not going to bring any of the diseases that I brought upon the Egyptians. Okay. It's not clear what's going on. If you're confused, that's good. Everyone is confused by what's actually going on. It seems to be saying that there was bitter water, it was sweetened, there was like a a biblical Brita situation going on, and they made, at that moment of the sweetening of the waters, something was given. Something was given, chok umishpat, but we don't know what that something was. Rashi says, Sham Sam Lo, quoting the Mechilta of Rabbi Yishmael, at Mara, he gave them a few sections of the Torah in order that they might engage in the study thereof, right? Miksat Parshiot Shel Torah. What do they call that in when you go to a fancy restaurant? A bouge amuse or something like that? Something to sort of sweeten the palate, to get you going. So something's going on at Mara that some laws to whet the appetite were given, and which laws, so they'd start sort of taking off their training wheels before the big show of Shavuot and Mount Sinai. Shabbat, Upara Aduma, and the laws of the red heifer, and dining, the administration of justice. Now, the reason this is very important for the manna story is it solves what question, Emily Thompson? It solves a question of how could God have referenced a law of the Sabbath being commanded prior to Mount Sinai. Say it again. Exodus chapter 15 is where, in the rabbinic imagination, the Sabbath was first given, because without that, it would make no sense, A, for God to have referenced the giving of the Sabbath law, Asher Tzivah, that God has commanded, and B, to have punished those no-gooders. You can't punish someone. What is that called? I never did more than take the LSAT, but I think it's called mens rea, right? Someone has to have the intent in order to be fully in breach of the commandment, which is exactly what they weren't, but now we know that they were, because the Sabbath had been given. And so too, in there are different lists. The Gemara asks with regard to the list of the Noahide mitzvot. So now we're just moving to Sanhedrin 56b, that it says that prior, Tanya, Eser mitzvot nitzavu Yisrael, that it says that the descendants of, how were they commanded? Isn't it taught in the Baraita that Jewish people were commanded to observe 10 mitzvot when they were in Marah? So this is the same scene of Exodus chapter 15. 7, that the descendants of Noah accepted upon themselves. So these were post-flood laws that were for all of humanity. And then now there were 3 more added. Judgment, dining, right? Kibud av va'em. What am I getting? Shabbat, Kibud av va'em, right? And dining, right? So 3 commandments. Now, what's the difference? Anyone paying attention? What is the difference between the list here? This is actually just a fun part of this. This is not central to it, but in one list, it's about Shabbat, dining, and para aduma. That's what Rashi says. And then in Sanhedrin, it says Shabbat, kibudav, which is the Hebrew for honoring father and mother, and dining and social laws. So where am I going with this? Baruch Epstein, the Torah Tamima, who lived 1860 and 1941, wrote the following. He solves an interesting question, and I'm sorry, I don't have the translation of this, but I'll just, on this same verse, on Exodus chapter 15, before Sinai, It says, Sha'al hadini nitzavu Yisrael b'mara, right? This is a language. And then it says, he says, V'yen beperush Rashi, bepazuk ze katav shenitzavu b'mara al dinin b'shabbat upara aduma. That he notes that Rashi has para aduma, and the Mefarshim sought to understand his words. Because how was it that Rashi had para aduma, but Sanhedrin had kibud av? Does anyone want to take a guess? What do para aduma, the red heifer, and kibud av have in common? I have a bottle of Macallan double cask right at my side. Anybody who gets it first in the chat room, you are going to get a commitment of a l'chaim. DS Sapin raised your hand. I can't call on you, DS. Oh, goodness, how do I do this? Q&A. Write it in the chat room. Okay. I can't see. The answer is, let me see how I do this. The answer is nothing. They have nothing in common other than the way they are written, because it says that if you have, even if you can't read Hebrew, everyone see where there's a pei there and there's an aleph there? If you're writing in Hebrew kibud av, it's kaf aleph. If you're writing para aduma, it's pei aleph. A pei and a kaf are almost identical, except for the little chip-chick thing in the middle of the pei. And Hamafarshim, they look for the lemakor, venir barur. It seems clear to me that it's a ta'ut sofrim, that it is a scribal mistake, that it had been written Shabbat and Dinin and Kibud Av and honoring father and mother, but the kaf got screwed up with the pei, and then some ma'atik added a mistake on a mistake, and then there was one tradition about it being para aduma, the red heifer, and another tradition of it being kibud av. So, all very interesting, but not to the point. The point is what he says next. He says, Veda, Dema she'anu noagin betfilat yom tov shechal b'shabbat uvekidush, lo'osif milot be'ahava uveratzon, hu mipnei shekol hamitzvot uvichlalam hamoadim nitnu b'sinai ukfiyat hahar kenoda. Which is to say, let me see, I think I translated that bit, that all of the commandments, including the holidays and everything else, were given at Mount Sinai, except for certain ones, which were given prior to Mount Sinai. And the Torah Tamima goes on to explain, you see in the English, it says, know that this custom that we practice in our festival prayers coinciding with the Sabbath and the Kiddush. So when you say Yontif Kiddush tomorrow or other tefillot, I copied a passage from the Amida. And have you ever wondered why at the moment of Shabbat, if you're saying a Yontif Kiddush, you add Be'ahava uveratzon, right? Love, ahava and ratzon, which means love and volition. It's because all the mitzvot, including the festivals, were given at Sinai under the force of the mountain. We're going to get to this momentarily, that they were forced to do it. But the Sabbath commandment was given at Mara with love and volition, without force, and therefore we add in remembrance Shabbat be'ahava uveratzon. The Sabbath, unlike every other commandment, was given with love and with, I don't know, ratzon, I guess I translate it volition. was given and received willingly, without, right? Here's a kiddush. Actually, this is the Amida. I'm still learning how to use Safaria, but it says Lavdecha be'emet b'anchilenu Hashem Eloheinu, and then that's the note to the davener leShabbat. On Shabbat, you add the words be'ahava uveratzon, besimcha v'zason, because there's a differentiation in the status of commandedness after being redeemed from Egypt, but prior to that moment of Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai laws have a different status. Those are commanded. And this next text only affirms that, right? That Moses led the people, and now we're going to go to after the Mount Sinai itself. Moses led the people out of the camp towards God, and they took their places at the foot of the mountain. So there are different midrashim about Mount Sinai, that God shopped the Torah around, and the Ishmaelites said, "What's in it?" And God said, "Then don't kill," and they said, "No thanks." And right, there's that midrash. Then there's this midrash, which is based on the word that it says betachtit hahar, that the children of Israel were at the, like your tuchas, what you're sitting on right now, that the children of Israel were at the tuchas of the mountain. But the rabbis say, no, it actually means that the mountain was literally over them. And that's what Rashi says, betachtit hahar, at the nether part of the mountain. Literally, it means at the base of the mountain, but a midrashic explanation says that the mountain was plucked up over them as a cask, so that God said in Godfather fashion, going to make you an offer you can't refuse, and the mountain, and it's just a sort of terrifically frightening notion of how the law was given, that they had to receive it, which is here, that and in Shabbat 88a, another section of the Talmud, it recites Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa, repeats the same, well, he doesn't repeat it, Rashi repeats the Talmudic passage, but it says, if you accept the Torah, excellent. If not, this is going to be your burial. But from here, there's a substantial caveat to the obligation to fulfill the Torah. The Jewish people can claim, right, what's a problem with this? Because is a covenant binding if it was accepted under duress? And the Jewish people can claim that they were coerced into accepting the Torah, and it's therefore not binding, right? If you were coerced into a contract, then it's not binding. But Rava says, even so, they accepted it willingly in the time of Achashverosh, as it is written, the Jews ordained and took upon them, kimu v'kiblu haYehudim, the Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, meaning, as was taught, the Jews ordained what they had already taken upon themselves through coercion at Mount Sinai. Okay, so that moment, let's try to see if I can figure out the questions. So we have multiple stages in the religious development of ancient Israel. The one that we're celebrating this evening is about the giving of the Torah, the commandedness of that experience of Mount Sinai. The first set of midrashim, the wild goose chase about the manna and could they collect it or not collect it on Shabbat, seems to suggest that in the rabbinic imagination, there was a period of time, arguably from creation itself, but certainly from Mara until Sinai, that there were laws that were being followed or in breach by ancient Israel, not under the duress of the mountain, but by way of ahava, love, and ratzon, volition, that ancient Israel took upon themselves Jewish identity, not because they were, to use Lefkowitz's language at the beginning, not because of fear and trembling, but because of love, because of love, because of an enthusiasm to perform the divine will. And then, and that's really interesting now to think about Shabbat and Kiddush and so much of Jewish life and living. And then there's this post-Sinaitic tradition, or this rabbinic struggle with whether or not law can still be binding, even if that Sinaitic experience was under duress of the mountain, and an affirmation by the rabbis of the Talmud in that passage in Shabbat, that even though one could quibble with the manner it was given at the get-go, ultimately in the time of Purim, through this dramatic rereading of a text that actually has nothing to do with that, the rabbis assert that a moment was regained of observance, again by way, it seems, of kiblu v'kimu, or kimu v'kiblu, that they accepted upon themselves, not with the language of love, but there was a receiving of Torah that wasn't about standing literally beneath the Torah over their heads. And I think this is deeply important for us as contemporary Jews. Because if you were to take the cycles of Jewish history and the manner by which Jewish law has bound the Jewish people, both the pre-Enlightenment notions of textual authority and also pre-emancipation manner by which Jewish community was formed, didn't allow for the possibility that Jewish identity, observance, mitzvot, deeds could happen in any miskeret, in any way outside of conventional notions of Sinaitic commandedness. And what I love about these texts is that they seem to suggest that the rabbis had a rather developed notion long before J. Lefkowitz that sometimes and in some places Jews do what they do not because merely or solely a belief that God commanded it, which I think is where a lot of us are today, that we're looking for language to give meaning to our patterns of observance that has authority, that binds us as a people, that can be passed down from generation to generation, but that's not contingent on the mountain hanging above us. If you look at, there's a lot of questions here. me share with you this. And by the way, as we're rounding the bend, if there are things that you want to ask or say, then please type it in the Q&A. Abraham Joshua Heschel, in his God in Search of Man, page 302 to 304. For reasons of time, I'm just going to go to, well, he says a theological exaggeration. Jewish tradition does not maintain that every iota of the law was revealed to Moses at Sinai. This is an unwarranted extension of the rabbinic. Okay, so he's challenging this notion that there's only one way to understand Revelation. And then he says here, he's actually quoting Moshe Cordovero. This is Heschel quoting Cordovero. A great Jewish authority offers the following remarks on our theme. How did the generations prior to Sinai attain spiritual integrity? Right, what we're talking about tonight, prior to Mount Sinai. How can we say that the patriarchs stood as high or higher than the community of Israel, since in their time the commandments were not yet given, and so all their acts of piety could be voluntary service, but not commandments? Right? There's also a whole rich literature that we haven't gotten into, and we don't have time to, about commandedness. What is more righteous, to do something and be commanded, or to do something and not be commanded? The rabbis have taught that history can be divided, this is Heschel quoting Cordovero, into three periods: the age of chaos, the age of Torah, and the prelude of the Messiah. The patriarchs lived in an age of chaos, during which his holy presence could only be found in a very veiled form. This is the age of the patriarchs. Yet despite the darkness and the barriers, they were able to discern 7 commandments. These are the 7 Noahide commandments, covering the vast bulk of the book of Genesis up to Sinai. He who attains a little under such difficulties is counted as having as much merit as one who attains much in a time of plenty. Whoever was able to perceive and maintain the 7 commandments of Noah during the age of chaos did as much as one who keeps all the Torah in a time when God's word was more full, meaning after Sinai. The power to observe, this is such a sentence, the power to observe depends on the situation. So in this age, we are not obligated to fulfill the laws of the temple, and the little that we do is counted as equal with the observance of those who were able to fulfill the laws that were possible in the time of the temple. In the time of the temple, in the time of Abraham, it was not amiss to neglect the commandments, for their time, for their fulfillment had not yet to come. Each word and each deed of the law has its own time in which it can and must be kept. And so I see there are a few comments here, but the argument that Heschel is making here is, well, it's layered. I'm just watching the time. There are different chapters of ancient Jewish history where there were different laws given, and there might have been different motivating clauses for the observance of those laws. We too are in our own time, Heschel saying, quoting Cordovero, if you pick up Heschel's book, that we're also searching for the language. In, where is it? It's here somewhere. I didn't quote it because it's hard to quote, but in Heschel's Torah Min Hashamayim Be'aspeklaria Shel Hadorot, there's an entire chapter, page 154 onwards of volume 2, entitled Vehechan Diber, and where did he say it? And it is an exploration of all of the moments where observance and laws are referred to, but there's no point, right, whether it's a manna or after the death of Nadav and Avihu, hu asher diber, this is what God commanded. But the notion that there could be a commandedness, a notion of Torah-itic authority that transcends a sense of Sinai. And it's not without note that this holiday we're reading Ruth. And why Ruth? There are a million explanations of Ruth, but we read Ruth because it's all about the acquisition of Jewish identity. As Ruth says to Naomi, do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and follow. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts. Ruth acquires Jewish identity by way of love and volition, ava uveratzon, not because she's forced to. She's our hero of this story, Ruth, and she's the hero of Shavuot. You could, if you wanted to go there, and I do, so I will, read Ruth as a counterbalance, kind of like how on Yom Kippur we read all about ritual and the Torah reading, and then the Haftorah reading is Isaiah saying it's not the sacrifices God wants, but it's for you to afflict your soul. That's what Yom Kippur is all about. You could understand the reading of Ruth, your people will be my people, where you go, I will go, as a corrective to the notion that Jewish identity can only be received, covenanted at Mount Sinai. That there's a Jewish identity, and perhaps this is more compelling to us today than it might have been in pre-enlightenment, pre-emancipation, that is about ahava and ratzon, love and volition. I want to pause there. I do have one more text, which hopefully we'll get to, but if anyone on the text side, Natalie Barth, Benjamin Rosenbach, okay, so let's say, similar to the question of how do the Israelites know to collect a double portion for Sabbath before the laws, how are they supposed to know what this seventh day should look like? I think that is exactly the point, if I understand your question, Benjamin, correctly, that the proof text, that there are these laws that are commanded prior to not just Shabbat. There are other pre-Sinaitic legislative moments. I've just focused on one about Shabbat. Natalie Barth asks, I understand your point, but your premise, if I understand it, is that the Israelites changed, accepted, voluntarily chose to observe, believe, etc. But didn't God's stance approach also change from fear and fury to a more kingship partnership? Curious your thoughts. So, look, I think, look, the chutzpahdik answer to your question, Mrs. Barth, is that, yeah, of course, that it's not just our context and we who have changed. And I saw Dan Cedarbaum was on this, but our notion of God has changed over time. And God, and how did Ben Summer once put it? That our theology recapitulates sociology. So where we are as contemporary American Jews necessarily informs how we believe or don't believe in a God who commands and otherwise. Look, at my Yontif dinner tonight with my children, we were talking about, we actually usually don't talk about God, but God came up in the conversation, and the question came up as to whether or not we can believe in a God where terrible things, as we're experiencing now, are happening, and whether our sufferings are somehow a reflection of God's will. To which we discuss the Talmudic line that, you know, I want neither the sufferings nor the wisdom acquired by way of that. That's not the God I believe in, who teaches lessons by way of pandemics. So I don't believe in that God. But if I was an ancient trying to make sense of my moment, then the idea that there's a pandemic and global affliction, I might understand that, and ancients did understand natural disaster as a reflection of God's will. So we're far afield, but yes, we have changed. Last question. So doesn't Heschel's interpretation, this is anonymous, so doesn't Heschel's interpretation imply a living Torah that changes with historical times? Yes, absolutely. And I think that if you want to read it in Hebrew, you can read Torah min hashamayim, sorry about my background, V'aspaklaria hadorot, or you can read Heavenly Torah, this light bedside, look at that book, from translated by Gordon Tucker, which is Heschel coping and grappling with the question of how we understand the authority of the text. And not that I should self-promote, but I'm actually reading Arnie Eisen's article on Heschel's notion of revelation in my Tuesday morning class, which you are all invited to. Just go on the Park Avenue website on Tuesday. So this concept of Meredith asks, concept of volition versus command and mitzvot would lead to the concept or the belief that there's a tradition and or belief that converts, Jews by choice, have an elevated status. Do they? Is this why? Look, I think that sort of conventional understandings of status is that Jews born or converted to Judaism have an equal status. That's the whole point, that there is no differentiation between, there's actually, but it depends on the language, on the text you cite. There are texts that we certainly have some ugly texts in our tradition that denigrate the status of a convert. There are also texts that elevate the status of a convert, and there are texts that seem to affirm that one receives extra mitzvah points by way of only by way of being commanded. So if a non-Jew chooses to observe kashrut, whereas it's nice, they don't get the mitzvah point because they're not commanded to do it. So with that, the last text, just so you have it, but we're not going to read it, but I'll share with the JCC. This text is sort of a closure. Chancellor Eisen, who's retiring right now from the Jewish Theological Seminary, talks about, quoting Kaplan, Mordechai Kaplan, that there are different forms of obligation, and neither should we restrict the notion of mitzvah to behavior undertaken by Jews in obedience to commandments believed to have been given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. So there's not only one way by which to understand the notion of commandedness. There is pre-Sinai, there is post-Sinai, and one of the most exciting projects of Jewish thought and observance right now is to find the language to create a compelling argument for observance in our time, which is kind of what I do every day.